Underground in the Watchtower. David was a Jehovah's Witness for 13 years, serving as an elder. Now he's a believer in Jesus. He actively ministers to questioning Jehovah's Witnesses and the Christian church through the newsletter, Comments from the Friends, and his book, Jehovah's Witnesses Answered Verse by Verse. Now we can listen to David read.
If the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses has any spies attending this convention, they'll be especially interested in this talk because I'm going to speak about some of the things that are going on inside the Watchtower organization in what could be called loosely organized Watchtower Underground. And I'll be talking about some of the individuals who are still in the Watchtower but are operating underground against the organization. These are people who are Jehovah's Witnesses still in good standing as far as the organization is concerned. But first I'd like to talk about the term underground. We usually use that word in relation to political movements, political resistance movement operating in a totalitarian state. We don't hear of any underground here in the United States of America because people are free to express their political opinions. We have political parties of all different ranges. People can speak in opposition to government policies if they want to. They can organize opposition groups. People can publish all kinds of literature disagreeing with what the government might say. So we don't have an underground in the United States. Even if people have very radical opinions, they don't have to go underground with them. But we do use the word underground in connection with the resistance movements during World War II, the resistance movements that were formed in some countries occupied by the armies of Nazi Germany. There were underground movements against the totalitarian state. Or we might think about the Soviet Union, where publishers of underground literature face the possibility of arrest and exile to Siberia for publishing opposition literature. But even Russia is now experiencing a time of glasnost, they call it. Now, I probably didn't say that right. If anybody here knows Russian, you could tell me how to say it. But the newspaper uses this word, Russian word glasnost, that's translated openness. We don't know how long it will last or how far it will go, but the Soviet citizens seem to enjoy right now some freedoms that they didn't have a year or two ago. And I have here an article from Time magazine that talks about that. It talks about testing glasnost boundaries in the September 7th issue of Time magazine. A few years ago, the people in Russia could only read Pravda, the official party newspaper, or Izvestia, the official government newspaper, or a few other approved publications. But right now, other underground or other newspapers, other publications that formerly would have had to be circulated underground are circulating openly in Moscow. So things have changed. This Time magazine article says, for example, a 55-page journal of comment whose editor has served 9 years in prison for his dissident views was being allowed to circulate freely now. So there's been a change. What a shame, then, that at a time like this, some 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses are still being forced to read only their own Pravda and Izvestia, the Watchtower and Awake magazines. Yes, there's more freedom of the press right now in the Soviet Union than there is in the Watchtower Empire. I can testify to that personally because I was put on trial and disfellowshipped for publishing an underground newsletter. My wife Penny and I were Jehovah's Witnesses in good standing. I was a witness for 13 years, and she was raised in the organization. And we were both what you might call model witnesses. We had both pioneered for a couple of years. I was an elder for 8 years. And we didn't do anything apostate. We didn't read any apostate literature. We never even knew where to get apostate literature. We didn't do anything that would be in open opposition to the Watchtower. But in order to become better witnesses, we started reading the Bible. And this personal Bible reading led us to question some of the Watchtower's teachings. Not major doctrines. We apparently missed things about the deity of Christ when we read through the Bible the first time on our own, but we did pick up a few things. We picked up some relatively minor things. We could see that Jesus wasn't teaching that you had to wear a certain haircut to be approved, or that you couldn't wear a beard. Jesus even had a beard, except in some of the publications where they showed him without one. But we began to question some of the very small teachings of the Watchtower. And then the December 1st, 1981 Watchtower came out with some statements that we found very objectionable in the light of our Bible reading. For example, in the December 1st Watchtower of 1981, the Society denied that they had ever gone back to previous points of view. And yet we knew that they had just gone back a few months before to the previous view of disfellowshipping. Because when we were witnesses back in the early 70s, we knew that you couldn't talk to a disfellowshipped person. And then from 1974 onward, you could. And then again in 1981, you couldn't. So we knew they had gone back to a previous point of view, and yet they said they didn't in the December 1st, 1981 Watchtower. And we also objected to one paragraph on page 27, where they said the following, quote, Jehovah God has also provided his visible organization, his faithful and discreet slave. Unless we are in touch with this channel of communication that God is using, we will not progress along the road to life, no matter how much Bible reading we do. End of quote. Well, that really bothered us because we were reading the Bible on our own and we really loved it. And it upset us that the organization was elevating itself above the Word of God. So I sat down at my typewriter and I put together this newsletter, just a typewritten newsletter, and kind of messy. The E's and the O's are all black because the typewriter hadn't been cleaned out. It wasn't much to look at, but I put it together and took it down to a local print shop and had 1,000 copies printed up. And in that newsletter, I disagreed with some of those things the Watchtower had said about their not going back to previous points of view and about being in touch with the organization being the way to get to salvation, no matter how much Bible reading you did otherwise. And I printed up 1,000 of these copies. And Penny and I knew that we were not enjoying a time of glasnost or openness in the Watchtower. So we didn't just put our return address on these. We knew better than that. So I signed them Bill Tyndale, Jr. And I said right in there that it was a pen name or a pseudonym. I didn't try to pretend I was really Bill Tyndale, Jr., but I was using that name because I remembered what happened to William Tyndale, the translator of the Bible into English. The authorities in his day had him publicly strangled and burned at the stake because of what he had done. And I expected that's what the Watchtower would like to do if they could. Well, we took this newsletter and had it printed up, and one night after midnight, we took all the newsletters, and we had addresses on them that we had looked up in the telephone books in public libraries, addresses of kingdom halls all across the United States, and addresses of witnesses that we knew. And we put them into shopping bags and took them out after midnight because we had witness neighbors who might have seen us and reported us to the elders. And we drove across the state lines. We didn't even want to have a local postmark on these things. So we drove into Rhode Island and mailed some there, and then we drove into Connecticut and mailed some there. And we had some left over, so it was around Christmas time, so we sent some of them down to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in a big brown envelope and asked the postmaster to put the Bethlehem postmark on them, because people did that with Christmas cards, we knew. So a bunch of them went out from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania with a Bethlehem postmark. And we also heard about a little town in New Mexico called Truth or Consequences. So we got a bunch sent down there, and they had the Truth or Consequences postmark on them when they went out. Well, we enjoyed having this little underground newsletter for a while, and this went on for a couple of months. We put out a couple of issues, and people began to wonder who was doing this, even in the locality where we lived. Well, my best friend found out that it was me, and the first thing that he did was go to the elders and tell them that I was the one publishing this. So we didn't know that he had done that at first, but we were still conducting studies and reporting them at the Kingdom Hall, and we were still going out in service, except when we would go out in service, we would have with us, instead of the Watchtower, in our book bag, we would have the little Gospels from the American Bible Society, Gospel of Matthew and Gospel of John. And I was still the book study. Had at that time been removed as an elder because of some things I said at the Kingdom Hall, but I was still conducting the car group. So I would assign the witnesses to work over here and over here, and Penny and I would go this way working together because we didn't want anyone else to know we just had Gospels in our book bag instead of Watchtowers. And we were studying with the people that we had been studying with before and still reporting the studies, except at the studies we stopped using the Society's publications and started using just the Bible and unteaching what we had taught them before. Well, anyway, my best friend reported to the elders that I had published this newsletter. So we were coming home one evening from one of these Bible studies we were conducting, and we had to park a little way down the street because there was a lot of cars parked in the area. And as we walked toward the house, a couple of men got out of a parked car, and we saw these men in trench coats walking toward us, and when they stepped into the light, we realized it was two of the elders. And they immediately accosted us on the street and said, "Are you going to publish another issue of that newsletter?" And I tried to engage them in dialogue as to what there was in the newsletter that they disagreed with or why they would even question it. And they said, "We don't want to talk about anything that's in it. We just want to know if you're going to publish another issue." And I told them they'd find out when they got the next one in the mail. So we went home, and a couple of days later we got a phone call telling us that we were going to be put on trial for publishing that newsletter. And we were put on trial. We didn't bother to attend the trial because I had already sat through several hours of trials about the length of my hair, and I didn't want to go through another one over the newsletter. But they tried us in absentia and expelled us from the congregation. We were not physically sent to Siberia, but we did lose all our friends. Some of these were very close friends. People that Penny talked to on the phone every day called up and said, "Penny, I'm not going to talk to you again. This is the last time. Goodbye." We lost some relatives that we left behind in the Watchtower. So we got a real taste of the fact that there is no freedom of the press for Jehovah's Witnesses. Yet, in spite of taking such action against an individual member publishing a newsletter, the Watchtower organization tries to maintain a public image of promoting freedom of expression. And they're doing that especially right now in the last couple of weeks. For example, they just published this article in the October 22nd Awake, October 22nd, 1987. And they're discussing here in an article about the United States Constitution and Jehovah's Witnesses, they're telling how when local officials some years ago tried to prevent them from distributing their literature, they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won the case. And in the article here, they rejoice in that fact, and on page 26 they say, "The court stated that the privilege of freely disseminating religious teachings by the printed page exists apart from state authority. It is guaranteed the people by the federal Constitution. Simply put, the state could not take away what the Constitution had already given." End of quote. But the Watchtower Society can take that freedom away and does take it away from Jehovah's Witnesses. In the May 1st, 1984 issue of the Watchtower, under the heading Questions from Readers on page 31, it asks this loaded question: why do Jehovah's Witnesses decline to exchange their Bible study aids for the religious literature of people they meet? And I'll quote a couple of passages from that article. It says, "It would be foolhardy as well as a waste of valuable time for Jehovah's Witnesses to accept and expose themselves to false religious literature that is designed to deceive. They have no intention of falling into the sad course of the Jews, whom Paul said exchanged the truth of God for the lie." And quoting further, "Furthermore, some of the religious literature that people may urge Jehovah's Witnesses to read is written by or contains the thoughts of individuals who have apostatized. True Christians are commanded to shun such apostates. Hence, it is out of wisdom and respect for God's counsel that Jehovah's Witnesses do not make a practice of exchanging valuable Bible study aids containing scriptural truth for religious literature that disseminates error or apostate views. End of quotes. So the witnesses have been totally forbidden to read religious literature from any other source than the Watchtower. But that prohibition doesn't just stop with religious literature. The Watchtower deprives them of freedom of the press in all matters. And they've stressed that just recently in the September 1987 Our Kingdom Ministry. It contains a question box asking the question, is it proper to circulate among the brothers printed material on matters such as medical or counseling services? And this is the Society's answer. Among the things they said was, quote, the congregation is not to be a channel for distribution of private material in printed form or audio or videotapes. Even if some are not distributed to gain business, they may well contain private views put in theocratic language with Bible citations. And then they continued by saying, problems and confusion have resulted because brothers and sisters innocently passed on such privately prepared material. All of us, especially the elders who work in harmony with the faithful and discreet slave, and who are looked to for guidance, should want to avoid contributing to such difficulties. Nor should we promote anyone's business or someone's business or ideas and philosophy by circulating such material among the brothers. End of quote. So if you are a Jehovah's Witness, you don't dare read other literature. You just stick to reading Pravda and Izvestia, the Watchtower and Awake magazines. Well, what about radio and TV? We've known in the past that the Soviets have been known to jam Western radio broadcasts so that their people wouldn't hear uncensored programs. Well, the Watchtower Society hasn't yet figured out how to jam the radio and TV sets of Jehovah's Witnesses, but it can frighten them into not tuning into such programs. And the November 1st, 1987 Watchtower contains just such an article. This Watchtower on page 19 has a heading, Keep Spiritually Clean. And under this heading, Keeping Spiritually Clean, it says, some have exposed themselves to possible spiritual contamination by tuning in to religious radio and television broadcasts. The Apostle Paul warned of a more lethal danger, apostate men who are subverting the faith of some. Individuals like that still exist. And they have a big exclamation point at the end of the sentence to make sure the witnesses get the point. And continuing to quote, and at times they have succeeded in sullying the thinking of others. Apostates often appeal to the ego, claiming that we have been deprived of our freedoms, including the freedom to interpret the Bible for ourselves. In reality, these would-be defilers are offering nothing more than a return to the nauseating teachings of Babylon the Great. True, such smooth talkers may look outwardly clean in a physical and moral way, but inside they are spiritually unclean, having given in to prideful, independent thinking. Well, they continue on the next page by saying, false religious propaganda from any source should be avoided like poison. Really, since our Lord has used the faithful and discreet slave to convey to us sayings of everlasting life, why should we ever want to look anywhere else? End of quote. Well, this sort of sets the stage for talking about the Watchtower Underground. It gives you an idea why Jehovah's Witnesses, if they want to exercise any independent thinking, as the magazine said, have to do it underground. They can't do it openly. And I promised to talk about some of the individuals who are operating in the Watchtower Underground, people who are Jehovah's Witnesses in good standing, yet secretly resisting the tyranny from Brooklyn. The current Watchtower material, which just read, shows why they have to go underground, and there are many of them. We only know about a few. I only know personally a few. who dare risk contacting us, but there are many. Some of these people write letters to us using just their initials on their return address in a post office box. Some take out an alias or an assumed name. I have people on the mailing list for comments from the friends who are named Grover Cleveland and Abraham Lincoln and quite a number of others with similar names. Now, of course, there could be somebody around named Abraham Lincoln today, but more often than not, these individuals turn out to be Jehovah's Witnesses who want to get the material without giving out their real name. And there are others who pick a little better assumed names that don't sound like assumed names, just find out later on that it's not their real name. Some of these witnesses have us write to them at their place of employment or in care of a neighbor so that people in the family won't see. In fact, some of them have even asked me to use a plain envelope so that you couldn't see what's in it, because they say there are people in the local post office who are Jehovah's Witnesses and who would report them to the elders if that material passed through the post office going to their house, especially in small towns where the postal people know the local residents. So in talking about them, I'm not going to give their real names either, or their specific location, or anything that would aid Watchtower special committees to track them down. First, I'll talk about John Smith. John first made contact with apostate ex-witnesses at a large district convention. Ex-witnesses were picketing outside, carrying signs encouraging the witnesses to read the scriptures and think for themselves. John walked by with his family and held his nose in the air and conspicuously avoided looking at the signs, just like all the other witnesses were doing. But then, after he got his family inside the assembly hall, he came back by himself, and very quickly he stopped in front of one of the picketers, and he said, "Where can I meet you after the sessions?" in a very low voice. And the picketer said back to him, "In the parking garage at the lower level." And just like that, the conversation ended, and John Smith kept on walking. Well, he met the ex-witnesses later on in the parking garage at the lower level, and it was a very brief meeting. He was looking both ways all the time, and he stopped just long enough to get some forbidden literature and to tell them that he agreed with them, but didn't dare to say so openly. Why? Well, because his family are all strong in the organization, and his wife's family are all strong in the organization, and they were both newly married. And besides that, he works for a witness. So if he were to openly oppose the organization, he would lose everything, possibly even his wife. Eric Johnson, again not his real name, writes to us from one of the Scandinavian countries. He's been on the mailing list for comments from the Friends since early in 1982, shortly after we began publishing. And he sent us some useful information and suggestions for use in comments from the Friends. But he's still in the organization. In his last letter, he reminded me not to use his name when publishing material he supplied. But then he added, and this gave me some encouragement, he said, "I have not disassociated myself yet, though the time for that cannot be far away." John Doe lives in the Midwest, and I won't tell you what city because it might be a clue as to who he is, but he's been in touch with us since mid-1984. He resigned his positions of responsibility in the Watchtower organization because he couldn't in good conscience continue to function in that capacity. But he does remain a witness in good standing, and he continues somehow to supply us with confidential information that's sent to the elders. Now, he isn't an elder anymore, but he's in touch with a little local network of underground witnesses, including some elders. And they pass on this information to him, and he in turn mails it on to us and to some other ex-witness ministries whose addresses he has. And yet remains totally anonymous as far as outsiders are concerned. We know who John Doe really is. He's given us his real name, and he's even sent us a picture of his beautiful family. We don't know who any of the others are in his little network, though. He's the only contact that we have, and they know who he is, but that's as far as it goes. John fears for his wife's health, if he were to openly oppose the organization. She isn't ready to go with him, and she's made that very clear. And he hates to think of what it would do to her and to the rest of the family if he were to make an open break, especially because her entire family is strong in the organization. But John is always sending us useful information. Every month we can count on the New Kingdom Ministry coming to us right away from him. In fact, he's also sending frequent gifts of $75 or $100 to help keep Comments from the Friends publishing. And sometimes he's even sent us information before the circuit overseers have gotten it. We got some information on one major change that the organization made, and we circulated that information around and publicized it, and a circuit overseer said to him, "Where did you get that?" The circuit overseer got it the next week. So it gives you an idea. I don't know who's in that little underground network that John Doe has. I don't know if there's any circuit overseers or district overseers in it or who's in it, but somehow they managed to get this material. Gary Swanson, I'll call him, lives in another state in the Midwest, and he's in a different underground network. He doesn't know who John Doe is, and John Doe doesn't know who Gary Swanson is. Even though they might rub elbows with each other at the same circuit assembly or district assembly, they don't know each other's identity because they're in little different underground networks. But Gary Swanson told us what he does with his issue of Comments from the Friends that he's been getting for quite a while. As soon as he receives a new issue, he smuggles it into his place of secular employment. And I say smuggles it because his boss is a witness. But his boss has given him permission to use the photocopy machine for personal matters. And so John makes copies of Comments from the Friends every page, just cranks them out on the photocopy machine. The boss never knew he'd use it for that kind of personal matter, but he gave him permission for personal use of the Xerox. And then Gary takes these 7 or 8 copies of Comments from the Friends and smuggles them back out of his place of employment and into the Kingdom Hall. And he distributes them to 7 or 8 witnesses in that Kingdom Hall who like to read Comments from the Friends. And, of course, they take theirs home with them or conceal them until they get into a safe place where they can read them. And then they get passed on to somebody else. Brother X in the northeastern United States is still an elder in the local Jehovah's Witness congregation. Although he carefully chooses what material he will or will not teach from the platform, there are certain things he feels in good conscience he can talk about and some that he doesn't. He first wrote to Comments from the Friends in December of 1986, and he's been in touch with us by telephone since then. He uses a false name, but we know his real name. Since he still holds a position of responsibility in the congregation, he's changed the way that we write to him. We used to write to him at a post office box using this false name, but now he has the mail come to his home in a plain envelope. And he told me not too long ago to address the envelope this way. He said, address it to the Metropolitan Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, care of Brother X. And the reason for that is that his family won't open those envelopes because it's congregation business. And so he gets Comments from the Friends and other literature in this envelope addressed to the Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, care of Brother X. And the family always treats that with great respect because it's a confidential congregation matter. Well, we could go on and on. There are many people who are still in the Watchtower organization, but who in their minds are liberated. There are sisters who are afraid of losing contact with their children and grandchildren. A brother who's afraid of leaving the organization because his elderly mother depends on him for her care, and she's a witness. And, what would happen if he were to be cut off from her? Some of these people are in different stages of their relationship with the Lord. Some of them are just questioning the Watchtower. Some of them have actually accepted Jesus Christ and yet are still functioning underground in the Watchtower organization. We need to be very patient and supportive of these individuals and not judge them because they haven't come out of the Watchtower yet. I have confidence that they will eventually come out. But in the meantime, they remind me of some people in Bible times who felt forced by their circumstances not to openly declare their discipleship for a time. There is a precedent for this. I think, for example, of Naaman, a pagan army commander. If we turn to 2 Kings chapter 5, we'll see the situation that he was in. He was the one who had leprosy and was sent to Israel to have his leprosy cured by the prophet Elisha. And in 2 Kings chapter 5, it tells us that Naaman said that he would never again offer sacrifice to any other god. But notice what it says in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. In speaking to the prophet Elisha, he said, "Yet in this thing may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there," and of course his master was the king of Syria, he said, "When my master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant in this thing." And then Elisha said to him, "Go in peace." So this man Naaman was in an interesting situation. He had become a worshiper of Yahweh and said he would sacrifice to no other god, but he was still a slave of the king of Syria who worshipped this false god. And so he wasn't liberated from that pagan system. Well, the prophet Elisha told him to go in peace when he said that. And it's between him and the Lord what his situation is. I think also of Nicodemus, who came to Jesus by night. We read about this in John chapter 3. Jesus had a number of secret disciples. He had plenty of Jews who declared themselves openly for Christ, but he also had secret disciples. And in John chapter 3, we read in verses 1 and 2, "There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews." So he was not just an average Jew, he was a ruler of the Jews. "This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, 'Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him.'" Well, he made this admission to Jesus privately at night. It makes me think of some Jehovah's Witnesses that came to a church that I spoke at not too long ago. The particular speaking engagement was at night, and 4 women came up to me afterward and told me they were Jehovah's Witnesses, and they said they'd been waiting for a chance to hear me speak. And I spoke at another church near their home on 2 occasions, but it was during the daytime, and they didn't dare come because they were afraid that an elder would be watching and find out who they were. We've heard of cases where the film Witnesses of Jehovah has been shown, and one brother was telling me how there were 4 cars parked outside the place where the film was being shown with elders watching to see what witnesses might go in to see the film. So these women came finally when I spoke at night, and so I can understand why a man like Nicodemus would go to see Jesus at night when he wouldn't be observed. Well, Jesus didn't reject him because he came at night and snuck in secretly. He went on and told them all about being born again and how you people must be born again. Well, if the story ended there, you might think, well, this Nicodemus, he never amounted to anything. He came secretly at night, and you never read about him associating with the apostles or anything, and shame on him. He didn't have the courage to come out. But we read later on that when Jesus had been crucified, 2 men showed up to take his body. And they went openly to Pontius Pilate, and asked for the body of Jesus. And then they went and took the body and carried it to the garden tomb. These 2 men were Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. So it may be that Nicodemus was just secretly a disciple all that time, but finally, after the crucifixion, he showed up openly as a believer of Jesus. In fact, we might turn there to John chapter 19, verses 38 and 39, and read about that. We'll be introduced also there to Joseph of Arimathea as well as to Nicodemus. In John 19, verses 38 and 39, it says, "After this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took the body of Jesus. And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. So these men were disciples of the Lord, but secretly, because they were afraid. They were afraid of the Jews. They were afraid of the circumstances that they were in. And so the Watchtower today drives believers underground out of fear, or else they drive them right out of the organization, either one or the other. The situation of Jehovah's Witnesses today is similar to that described in the October 8th Awake magazine in an article about the Spanish Inquisition. It's interesting how clearly the Watchtower can see some of these situations of oppression when they happen outside the organization. But when they do the very same thing, they either don't see it or their conscience is seared against it. In this article, they say, for example, on page 24, that the Inquisition was aimed at imposing, quote, strict religious uniformity, unquote, on the nation. And yet they feel that strict religious uniformity in the organization today is fine. It quotes a victim of the Inquisition on page 26 as saying, "We live in difficult times in which we can neither speak nor keep quiet without danger." There are Jehovah's Witnesses today who feel that way about their situation. And the Awake magazine concludes with a quote on page 27, "The concept of religious unity at any price is a dangerous one." And yet that is the very same thing that the Watchtower is doing. So, after talking about the Watchtower Underground and why the Watchtower Underground exists, we can only conclude that if the Watchtower Society would listen to its own advice in this regard, then there would not have to be a Watchtower Underground.